Right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the third and final webinar in our Threat Hunting with ATT&CK series. Well, before we dig into today's session, I would like to give a big thank you to everyone who participated in the conversation so far. We've had fantastic participation, gotten a lot of great feedback, and we're really thrilled that you're here for the final installment. So special thanks to the community and our speakers, and obviously to MITRE for their support and amazing work with ATT&CK. So today we're going to take an inside look at how leading organizations run an effective threat hunting program, right? And the goal being to drive better security outcomes, right? So we've talked a lot about some of the building blocks. The goal of all of this is to help organizations prevent breaches and reduce risk. And so I think we've got a great panel today that can kind of represent all of the stages of a really successful threat hunting program. From both an operations, research, and a business perspective. Before anyone asks, this session will be recorded. It'll be available and a link will be sent out afterwards. If you have any questions, please go ahead and ask them in the questions pane. We'll be keeping an eye on that throughout the webinar. We'll have some time to take questions at the end, but if you have any questions throughout, we'll certainly try to get to some of those if we can. So for those of you following along on social media, we'll be live tweeting today, so if you're on Twitter, feel free to join in the conversation either by following along, asking questions, or participating using the Hunting with ATT&CK hashtag.
I'm going to try it.
I'd like to introduce our presenters. I'm Keith McCammon. I'm the Chief Security Officer here at Red Canary. I'll be largely moderating and trying to stay out of the way of the three folks you actually came here to hear speak. So I'll let them each introduce themselves, starting with Brendan Smith.
I'm Brendan Smith. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for First Bank. I've been with First Bank for about 10 years in the financial industry. And I've been lucky enough to work with Keith and Casey Smith and others for several years now.
Fantastic. Brian.
Hi, I'm Brian Baskin, a Senior Threat Researcher at Carbon Black's Threat Analysis Unit, about 18 or so years in digital forensics incident response. So as a prior incident response consultant and helping SOCs build out their threat hunting capabilities.
Fantastic. Thank you. Tony, please.
I'm Tony Lambert. I'm a detection engineer at Red Canary, where we do threat hunting and continuous monitoring using process execution data.
Fantastic. Well, thanks particularly to you three for joining us today. In keeping in the spirit and the format that we've had so far, going to make this a conversation, right? So it's your show. I'll try to steer us through. For the folks attending, again, if you have questions, we'll be keeping an eye on those. And we'll either take them as we go or at the end. Without further ado, let's get into what we're here to discuss, right? So the three things we'd like to talk through are, how we go about automating a successful data analysis for purposes of threat hunting, measuring the impact of what we're analyzing, both from a data-driven perspective, but also measuring operational outcomes, and then kind of tying that all together and talking through the various other both technology and process drivers that help us enable this in the real world, right? Again, all driving towards real world outcomes of risk reduction and effective identification of adversaries, right? So we've talked through in the prior webinars, been using the context of the threat hunting maturity model, right? So starting from a very early stage program where you're just starting to go proactively, look through the data that you have and or identify what data you need. Starting to do that in a very ad hoc basis, right? And as you progress, obviously the expectation is that your process refines, you start to build or acquire new technology to help drive that process towards more consistent, more effective, more efficient results. Today we're going to look at tying this all together, right? To look at how really effective threat hunting teams operating as part of a larger information security program can tie all of this together, incorporate automation, and really take threat hunting to either the next level, or as for folks who have been doing this for a long time, thinking of as kind of realizing the promise that threat hunting has always had, right? It's not a new discipline. It's absolutely new to the industry in the sense that we finally started to to codify this process, to think of it threat hunting as both different and very complementary to, alert analysis, incident response, and other parts of investigation. So that said, we're going to start diving right into the content. We'd like to kick off by talking about automation, right? So again, the biggest differentiator between an early stage program and a level 4 program, and one that's like really tightly coupled with the rest of an organization's information security, posture and operations, is one that's figured out how to take automation of data collection, automation of data analysis, and then automation of as much of the the human selection and triage process as you can, like taking that, starting to codify it, and building it into a system that you can use where your humans are feeding that system, but ideally they're only doing as much as you haven't been able to teach technology to do yet, right? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tony. He's going to talk us through the data analysis process at a very abstract level. Then we're going to dive in with Tony, Brian, and Brendan here and start to dig into what a specific implementation of this looks like.
All right, so automation definitely plays a big part for us at Red Canary because we honestly don't have that many people as opposed to the number of endpoints that we end up monitoring, that we end up hunting for. We have thousands upon thousands of endpoints, and we can easily spend all of our day trying to just analyze each individual hunt result that we get. So we have to figure out a good way to accelerate the process and make sure that our resources are used wisely, make sure that our analysts, our engineers are used wisely. So in a initial just human process of the hunt, before you get started with automation, there's a very manual observation, hypothesis, data, and action process. There's a very scientific method that goes along with it. A good example of a simple hunt would be to look for MS word spawning PowerShell. This is a common behavior we see with phishing attacks. Our hypothesis that we end up generating is that malicious PowerShell code is executing. We have to generate code, and then we have to generate data to be able to see what happened and then take action. The cool part about any of this is that, well, most of it, is that you can automate parts that don't require a lot of human cognition. The observations parts, we can very easily say, these are the parameters we're looking for. We do this in detector code at Red Canary by saying we want to see all Microsoft Word processes that spawn PowerShell.exe. Formulate hypotheses, that's not as easy of an automation process, but something to keep in mind is that automation doesn't necessarily have to be an automated action. This can be documentation. It can be something that takes the thought process away from your analysts just a little bit and helps lead them into a decision-making process. For us, we end up automating this a little bit with documentation. Each of our detectors have some form of documentation where we can take a look and see what are the common activities that are associated with PowerShell spawning from Microsoft Word. Getting data and testing our hypotheses to see what is actually happening. This is automated by endpoint detection and response tools. Carbon Black very easily records data, and then we can pull it up later if we need to. And then action really depends on your organization. For some organizations, you may need to escalate to incident response via a ticket. If your ticketing system exposes an API where you can automatically create a ticket via hunt results, that's an easy way that you could automate that. And then we can get into further on the implementation side of it in just a second.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to interject to actually had the opportunity to give a talk with one of Brian's colleagues last week in New York, and we're framing this whole thing in the context of MITRE ATT&CK, right? And we think about ATT&CK as being extraordinarily useful as a tool for understanding and like talking amongst researchers and operations teams about like what we want to detect. An interesting thing, when you talk about making observations and gathering test data too, a use case for ATT&CK that like most folks tend to overlook is that you can look at ATT&CK, which not only has tactics and techniques, but also helps you understand what data sources you need to observe those things. like that's a great, particularly getting data and testing, right? ATT&CK is a great measurement tool for just understanding, even if I don't have time to ask questions of each of these tactics and techniques, do I at least have the data if I have to go investigate later, right? So it is like a great measurement and kind of roadmap tool just to make sure that you're collecting the right data, even if you haven't figured out how to operationalize it yet. And I know, Brian, we talked a little bit about that last week.
Yeah, and I think get data here is core to everything we're speaking about. Like that is the core. To be able to automate, you have to have some sort of data in front of you to give context to. And really, like that is my big givens is context runs all of this. And that's not just go out and run queries and get queries back and look at data. It's having some sort of baseline, some sort of blueprint of your environment to say that these applications should exist on these boxes, but they should not exist on these boxes. So that query just gives you raw data back. But to be able to take that context of saying these users are fine running this application on these limited servers, that is the key to everything. And you can build that into your automation as well. So when you say take action, you get data, you can say, okay, if this machine comes up and it fires an alert, it's fine as long as it has these narrow constraints on it. So I think that really builds on the automation part, is being able to automate the context as well, other than just the queries, is adding in your context and adding in your knowledge into all of this.
That's great. It's kind of the stole a line from the esteemed CISO over there at Carbon Black, as like visibility kind of being the metric that matters most, right? If you can't see it, all of these other discussions are effectively like they're all theoretical and not terribly useful, right? So yeah, didn't mean to detract, and I appreciate the context. So let's move on. Let's look at an example implementation. So go ahead, Tony.
So when we start implementing an actual hunt to search, something like that, we can automate the implementation of a hunt, not just the analysis process as well. Again, starting out with the human hunt, what we would see initially, we would see a broad search like Microsoft Word spawning PowerShell. From the alerts that we get in with this, we have to tune it just a little bit. There might be legitimate instances of Microsoft Word spawning PowerShell because we might have Word add-ins, we might have some sort of weird administration tools that are going on. Every environment's a little bit different. Your environment may use PowerShell scripts coming off of Word add-ins very, very often. And you have to tune those out to decrease noise, to make sure that your analysts are using their time effectively, looking for things that actually matter. So once you start investigating, start alerting, you go through, you figure out which scripts don't matter, which PowerShell commands don't matter. You can go back and you can tune an alert. You can go back and make sure that we exclude the things that we don't look for. We can only trigger on things that we want. And if you want, you can even start determining more behavior in PowerShell. We only want to see more PowerShell that downloads binaries. We only want to see more PowerShell that's encoded. Something that we do at Red Canary is that we automate a good part of this process. We automate some of the tuning and some of the recommendations that we have for detectors at the end, either at the end or beginning of the week. We give reports back on which detectors produce the most events, which don't, which are the most least effective in terms of analyst hours, and it makes recommendations of how we can improve them by being able to exclude certain things.
That's awesome. Yeah, appreciate that. And it's kind of interesting hearing you talk through that, particularly going through the process of identifying that broad searching, and then getting from there down into tuning and focusing, right? I mean, so starting to figure out, given these really broad criteria that I tasked the platform with, having a really wide set of results that may or may not be applicable inside of an organization, suppressing what's good, and continuing to look through what's left is really, like, I would say that's absolutely a hallmark of a really effective program. And it's actually Brendan has worked with you for a long time. You're one of the earliest very vocal proponents of application whitelisting, right? As a means to like drastically reduce attack surface. And Tony, as you're talking through this, and obviously I've had many discussions with Brian about this, it's starting to take that same positive approach of taking only allowing what we know to be good, and then assuming that we've got to look really closely at everything that's left. it's very, very akin to application whitelisting, just extended now into like behavior in the context of an organization, right? So, and with that, I think so Brendan would like to kind of talk to you about, next thing on our agenda was really improving outcomes, right? And starting to figure out how do we take something like this where we have an abstract process, and then this is obviously one specific implementation. There are hundreds or thousands of times that you kind of go through this process to achieve coverage. So yeah, talk to us a little bit about, just kind of your overall approach to understanding like how you and your partners use hunting to improve outcomes for your team, and then we'd like to dig into that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we've touched a lot on the most important part of this, which is you got to have the visibility that you need for your teams to explore. And across each different tool that you integrate into your system, you first got to understand, well, what's the new visibility that tool brings to my environment? And then how do I apply that and build a structure around it so it's repeatable? One of the biggest pain points I think we have is that you get into kind of tool overload at times, right? And so you have the visibility, but you don't have that if you don't have that formal process that then supports your hunting program, that visibility is not going to do you any good. And so I think formalizing that hunting process so that you can just sort of plug new tools and new layers of visibility maybe into your process has been key for keeping a good program running and integrating new tools effectively. And so we found that over and over again. You touched on application whitelisting, and that's a phenomenal place where you need really solid process, because you're going to have a ton more visibility than you ever had in your network and your endpoints when you implement whitelisting or something like that. So if you don't have that kind of formalized threat program that you've thought about in advance, you'll get lost in the data. And so I think that's some of the experiences we've had in bringing in new tools and looking at how we develop our threat hunting program.
That's excellent. And Brian, I know you've got some, similarly. So Brendan, like your experiences in the context of doing this as part of a big, like really high functioning security program. Brian, not to say you're not part of a high functioning security program too, but you've got a different focus. So, how do you, so like as a researcher and someone who spends like a lot more time in the data and even a few specific data sets, like how do you think through, kind of those same constraints, right? Like making sure that you did, even though a lot of your job is to kind of go down effectively rabbit holes sometimes,
Right.
if you do that too much of the time, you don't get your outcome that you're after. How do you think about that and balance that?
So yeah, there's a huge difference between just random guessing and hunting and not knowing what you're looking at versus these queries are good, they're going to find badness, and you have to keep on them and fine tuning them and making sure they work. And we've seen that a lot with some of our clients, doing IR work in the past, where they've gone through a major breach, they've gone through a major exercise, and they have a set of fine-tuned queries they know will find the adversary, but then they just kind of put them to the side because the IR is over with, not realizing that 2 weeks later, a month later, even 3 months later, the adversary is going to sit and then come right back using the same old tactics. So having the operationalized hunting is key of having the set standards of here's how I'm going to hunt, not only for this bad guy, but in the future, this whole TTP or threat ID. But at the same time, being able to take those and manipulate them, change them, take them, remove some fidelity indicators to say, let's just do random huntings based off this type of TTP and see what we have. And that's largely the data that we look through on a regular basis, is just knowing that this particular query and this particular TTP would find this bad guy. But let's look for code reuse. Look for other people who's like kind of took that, they took the white papers, they took the write-ups and changed the tactics just enough to throw off most hunting organizations. So yeah, there's a fine balance you have to ride there, but both are equally as important.
Yeah, it seems like that splitting the difference theme is super common, right? No matter which level you're kind of operating at or kind of approaching this from, which is that, you develop your hypothesis, you kind of move that through. It effectively does become a signature, but you have to make sure those aren't too fragile, right? Durability for detection is obviously like probably the most important aspect to all of this. So Brendan, would like to kind of return to you and talk through operational impact, right? So, and in particular, like how do you measure this, right? So a huge part of your job is making sure that like you and your business are getting their money's worth, in terms of investment, and that's not just tools, that's people, it's time. There's obviously a lot of factors. Why don't you, explain to us a little bit about how you think about that and how you approach it?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you touched on, this is super important because if you're investing a significant amount of time in your threat hunting program, your key stakeholders in any organization are going to want to know where those staff hours are going. And so it's important that you, when you're considering these programs, that you're thinking proactively about the metrics and what visibility you need to give to your stakeholders, like board members or regulators. And so for what I've often found is that when people are looking to assess the value of these programs, they ask questions that don't really get to what they really want, right? So they may ask questions like, well, how many times do we get attacked, or other things? That's really not useful information, because we're more interested in the threats that we're actually hunting that are in our environment and those types of things. So you give consideration to, well, maybe I need to tell my stakeholders, here's how many threats we hunted. Not all of them were successful, and that's okay, because then we folded them into lessons learned into maybe a playbook, or we supported them through automation. So I'm telling that story behind, yes, we're threat hunting, here's what we're finding, and when we're not finding actual threats, here's what we're doing to help make the program better. And I think if you pull that piece together using metrics and other things, that's the really key story to tell your stakeholders, so that they understand the value that you're bringing to this program. Whether you're finding real threats or not, it's about how you automate and then support the sort of the technology that's underlying the threat hunting program.
It's awesome. And actually, a quick question for you, if I may. Most of the measurement that we tend to think of is like things like mean time to detect, mean time to respond, and then when you're talking to the board, it's how many material events have we had, if any, and how am I kind of evolving the program? But how do you, internal to your team, when you're working with them and kind of giving them guidance and priority, like what rough percentage of their time, do you expect that they spend going to look for new things, right? So breaking outside of kind of the alert-driven and incident-driven parts of their process and, going to do things proactively. How do you manage to that?
Yeah, so in the ideal state, and not everything is always ideal, right? But I have a team of about 5 people fully dedicated to threat hunting, and so I would prefer about 20 to 30% of their time is sort of almost curiosity time, right? So go out and explore something new, talk about, like Tony's example, what if Word does execute PowerShell? Well, let's find those other scenarios. And so trying to be conscious and dedicate their time to that, knowing that there may not necessarily be true, value that comes out of that right away, but giving them the time to be curious and explore, I think, is absolutely critical to the threat hunting program, because it's through those conversations and that exploration that's maybe not tied to an actual incident yet that we learn all sorts of new things and we discover threats we've never expected to see before. So that's kind of how we manage the team, is trying to be very conscious about building that into their schedules and what they're doing in their day-to-day basis.
So I like the concept before about having a ticketing system for all these hunting, right? So in my mind, when I envision this, I see threat hunting ending up with unusual, suspicious behavior, which may end up in a ticket for someone to close to say, okay, I'm gonna hunt this down and figure it out. I also see threat hunting as creating more tickets, which is a good thing. You're finding more and more unusual behavior versus if you have a very immature team, you may be finding one thing here and there that's very obvious. Whereas like a set of very curious queries should find a whole bunch of weirdness for people to hunt down. Even maybe that comes off cross as you have a 3-time, 10-fold increase in tickets this week because you found so much more interesting data that you need to hunt down. As far as a metric standpoint, to show some sort of output from your hunting in some way. I think there's many ways of doing that, but definitely someone for a team to look into.
More tickets is better. You heard it here first.
Great. And actually, so Brian, you talked through that. The next thing we wanted to get into was really I think what probably most folks are here and interested in and kind of learning about, which are like case studies from hunting in an outcomes driven manner, either proactively or reactively, right? Hunting in a case where you suspect there might be something interesting and you need to confirm that. And also, some specific cases of going hunting for things that that there's an adversary or a threat that's materialized. You might not understand the scope or the complexity or all the TTPs being used. And so, as you're kind of talking about, being able to measure this, and we're kind of having this outcomes discussion, the first case study we wanted to walk through was, one of mergers and acquisitions, right? Which is a really classic case of, going to hunt under specific constraints when the stakes are typically really high, right? Like you know, as the acquiring organization, you want to make sure you're not buying your way into a breach or a huge problem. And we've seen, you know, with Yahoo and others, like there are very material consequences to those. So why don't you, you know, kind of talk us through your experience there and help us understand, you know, how that looks and works.
Yeah, absolutely. Because as we know, adversaries are riding that wave into our company. They can find a smaller company, you know, infected very easily and just sit and dwell for 6 months, a year as the actual M&A happens for that small company to be acquired. And doing IR work in the past, this has actually been a responsibility of mine, is doing generally health check environment of coming in as the acquirer saying, okay, we're about to hire the small company. We're literally going to plug the two networks together at the end of the day. So how do we make sure that the new network is safe from threats before we do so? So there's a lot of hunting that goes into it. And the biggest disadvantage you have is you lose all context. You know, you as a mature hunting team, you know your environment, you know your systems, you know your applications. You know nothing about this brand new network except at a high level network graph maybe, or one person you can talk to. So how do you do that in a way without context? And that's really understanding, you know, your industry, knowing your verticals, knowing what applications should exist and what roles should exist. There's that, as well as the fact that maybe you have differing solutions in place. Maybe you use carbon black response on your own network for visibility, and either the company does not have visibility or they use some other product. So there's very, you know, hard challenges in doing that. But the biggest issue is not just having no context, but also a time constraint. When we go into this role, we have basically 2 weeks at most of looking through a network environment, and that could be 10,000 endpoints, and making sure they're all clean. That's extremely difficult in itself. And so I think for most security teams, when you think about how mature you are and think about your capabilities, can you do that? Imagine yourself walking in, someone plugging a network into your environment. Do you feel confident you could find all the threats there? Because honestly, there's going to be a whole bunch of legal team and C-levels who are sitting there waiting on you to file a report so they can sign a contract that goes into that.
The stakes are high. And Tony, actually, so, you know, as Brian was kind of mentioning, you know, getting thrown into an environment where you have no context, since that's effectively your entire job. You know, we build context pretty quickly, but, you know, we effectively start with, you know, like no prior knowledge, right? So, you know, why don't you, you know, if you don't mind just kind of sharing some, you know, I don't know, interesting like tidbits or lessons you kind of learned just operating within that type of, you know, that type of constraint.
So sometimes we end up having to incorporate per customer exclusions because of interesting floods of events that we get. Sometimes, depending on the vertical, well, first off, like you mentioned, we get mostly no context or some context. Sometimes we'll get a brief, you know, what vertical are we now protecting? You know, this may be a financial vertical, manufacturing, education, something like that. So we kind of know what to expect. Luckily, we've got analysts who have worked in several verticals, and I used to be in higher ed. We have people who used to be in law and people who used to be in finance. So thankfully, we've got a good mix match of people that used to work in different verticals and know a lot of the software products and a lot of the behaviors that occur in different verticals. And we may end up getting a lot of events just flooding in saying, you know, Word is now spawning PowerShell, Word is now spawning CMD, all of these different things. And that occurs a lot in, we found in manufacturing environments where things are very automated. There are a lot of macros, there are a lot of other things that execute scripts behind the scenes. And then we have to take a adjustment period and sometime in the first probably couple of weeks and say, all right, here's how we're tuning so that this one customer doesn't drown out the events from all the other customers. And this becomes very interesting in outbreak scenarios such as EMATET. And we have to engineer automatic ways to mark things that we know are EMATET very, very quickly and ship those detections very quickly so that we don't have, you know, thousands of events coming in just for one customer with EMATET.
Yeah, really interesting. And actually, you know, Brian, so, you know, back to you, like most interesting thing you've seen hunting, as Tony's talking to like manufacturing environments, right? Where you see these things where a Word document starts like shelling out, and now you've got another process that has effectively, complete control of a system doing things that you don't have a lot of context into. Objectively terrifying. Sometimes it's legitimately bad. Sometimes it's fine. Like, what are some of the more interesting things you found, or kind of like the more challenging, cases people can expect to run into?
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen situations where, as we do this M&A health check, the compromise was actually 9 months prior. So when you're looking for events, it's actually events that happened prior to endpoint visibility actually occurring. So then we're actually hunting through registries, we're hunting through file system, we're hunting through timestamps to figure out exactly where things came from. And at that point as well, you start seeing the initial attack come through these old historic logs and then disappear. And now all you have is a single beacon to a hard-coded IP address once every 3 weeks. So at that point in your health study, how do you even find that? Because you've missed everything that leads up to that point. When we talk about the kill chain, you've lost the entire kill chain. You're at the very end now, and you still have to hunt and find those things. But we do definitely see that a lot. And I think one of the biggest constraints as well is that during this process, many organizations are coming into this hunt, and they realize, okay, 2 different products are in play, and they don't know how to either separate their queries or separate their hunting styles, to say, okay, this works in this carbon black response, it doesn't work in this environment. So how do we marry the 2 together? And I think that really falls back into what you guys Red Canary do, is that you don't work within the constraints of the product. You use open APIs, you use the tools, you leverage data. Use the product to get visibility, but then use your APIs to pull the data out into a structure that you can hunt in, and into a structure that and I think that's where organizations are slowly getting to, is knowing that at one point, I'm going to be able to look at data and don't want to be stuck into this UI. I need to be able to pull in data from multiple sources, and they need to start now getting prepared for that, getting your databases in place. Because Tony, I think that's all basically you guys do, right?
So, and something also to your point of having to hunt for malicious activity after the majority of it's already passed. Something that I've really noticed on our side is that behavior-based detection, it will go really far if you're early in some sort of kill chain, if you're looking early at execution, when you're establishing persistence. But if we're further down into the dwell time of somebody, where they have been in a network for 6 months, and then finally, hey, Red Canary is being deployed and we're doing this. What saves us a lot more in those instances are threat intelligence. Being able to incorporate threat intelligence, because all of the suspicious behavior has passed. It is really hard to detect just one random weird binary calling out if you have endpoint detection data only. So you have to incorporate a little bit of threat intelligence, have to incorporate a little bit more context to be able to see what's going on.
Yeah, Brendan, when you when you were kind of talking earlier, I think you used the phrase just basic preparation, right? It's just I don't know how, like, to what degree your team kind of thinks through like measurement and or like testing and vetting of that stuff, kind of like from a control and data inventory standpoint, but it seems like it's like definitely pretty applicable in your environment and realm, right? It's like not everyone can expect to walk into an environment where you do have 6 or 9 months of historical data to go ask questions of. Like, how do you guys handle that, or do you?
So we don't have a ton of mergers and acquisitions, but to your point, right, it's having your tool sets and knowledge of them ready to go so that they can be adaptable to other places. And so, I was thinking through their Brian and Tony's examples, and I think that they have such a really powerful story to tell, in that if your threat hunting program is mature, you have the flexibility to support the business and the decisions they're making. So if you are you've got good processes in place, right? And you can consume visibility from multiple different tools, and you have automated means to respond to those things. That allows your business to be much more flexible, right? And it gets security out of the way as an obstacle, which I think is just so important. And so it kind of feeds back into demonstrating value. And so I think when we think about that in First Bank's environment, the thought process is we need to be as adaptable and flexible as possible in what we're doing, whether it be on the endpoint or elsewhere in our environment, so that if we do acquire another company, we can provide that answer quickly and efficiently to the business, right? This multi-million-dollar deal Now we can say, you know what, we know our tool set, we know what their environment looks like, and they're good to go. Or they're not, we need to pump the brakes kind of thing.
That's awesome. And actually, yeah, so while we got you, Brendan, wanted to kind of talk through a case study from your perspective, right? So this is obviously like ATM attacks as a disruptor of everything from, you know, just a Friday night to an entire economy, or kind of, you know, we've seen those kind of across the board these last few years, and we've seen them for a long time, but they're finally becoming a little more prevalent. So yeah, why don't you, you know, it's kind of the next case study we'd like to walk through, you know, kind of tell us your experience there, and you know, give us a little bit of background and context in terms of how you think about that and prepare for it.
Yeah, absolutely. So this one is a little bit ripped from the headlines. So if you go out there's plenty of articles about this, but the particular attack I'm thinking of involves someone actually going physically to your ATM, drilling a hole that, you know, the size of a I don't know, quarter or so through the front of it. And then they, depending on how sophisticated the attacker is, they can actually get a USB snuck into the ATM all the way to the back of the unit and plug it in and run who knows what malicious code. That's just one example. There's several attacks that be conducted by actually drilling a hole in the front of the ATM. And so why this is so interesting to me in this context is that if we didn't have a mature threat hunting program with automation and visibility and all these things we've talked about, this could be very difficult for us to respond to. It's a non-traditional computing device. It's an ATM. For the most part, you may not be thinking about, hey, would somebody really have drilled into the front of this thing to conduct an attack? And so that's not often a variable you think about when you're thinking about cyber attacks. You might be thinking about phishing, not, you know, power drills kind of thing. And so where this pulls together is when they do that and they plug a USB in or do some other kind of attack that we've never seen before, do we have the right mechanisms in place that we're not going to panic and that we're going to catch this event as it occurs and be able to respond appropriately? And I think that's what we've talked about here, is putting those steps into place so that our teams can catch that event immediately. They have visibility, even though it's a non-traditional device. And then what we know what we're going to do to sort of respond to that and then help immunize, right, the other ATMs that are out there in case someone drives to a different one and we see another attack at a different location. And so I think this pulls together some of the expect the unexpected, right, and assume compromise. And how do you operate effectively in an environment where you're trying to assume compromise, even with non-traditional attack vectors?
So, you know, my favorite line of questioning is, you know, where are your troops and can I count them? And so, like, if, you know, as much as you're comfortable sharing, can you talk through just, you know, give folks a sense for, you know, faced with that type of problem, right? And so forget about ATMs as like a really specific thing, but, you know, if you abstract that out just a tiny bit, you've got tens of thousands of organizations with 10, you know, 5, 10, 100,000 plus endpoints. They look and smell just like the inside of an ATM, right? They have a USB, you know, port just like that. So, you know, it kind of abstractly, like how do you think about controlling that on the front end? How do you think about going to hunt for that, you know, using data sources that might be either obvious or a little bit less obvious to folks?
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned this, but I'm always a huge advocate of whitelisting, right? And so for me, that's how you start, because I need that visibility and I want that control. But it doesn't stop there, right? So if someone plugs a malicious USB device in, you're not really sure how they got it or where it came from or those different things. Maybe it stops at the whitelisting layer, maybe it doesn't. But we need to take that data and then kind of pursue additional investigation, right? So what did it try and run? What were the behaviors that it executed? Can we build that in as indicators of compromise elsewhere in our system? And then comes in sort of the curiosity piece, right? Can we go find this anywhere else in our environment? Maybe they didn't try USB, but maybe the same party used it in a phishing email or something else. And so it's taking one event and it's trying to pull out all the different pieces that we can use to then automate our response across 10,000 endpoints or 100,000 endpoints. Because you really want to take any opportunity that's given to you by an attacker, from my perspective, to learn as much as you can and then build your program. And so start to finish, right, you got to take every opportunity they give you to build those IOCs and automate your response process so that it does scale as big as your environment is.
Awesome. And Brian, it's like one of the things that, you know, we were kind of chatting about last week just was, you know, you kind of play in this massive sandbox, right, where you've got data from not just a lot of organizations and endpoints, right, but, you know, you're like application whitelisting and application control are like, you have access to some of that data set, or sometimes you're going to customers to get it, right, if they're in a pinch. you've got, carbon black response, which is kind of at the extreme end of visibility, and then you've got defense and like the PSC platform. So, you've not only got this kind of massive set of data in general, but you're getting it from, different controls, which are looking at things, for different reasons and in different ways. Like, I don't know, we need to get kind of, your bent on what Brendan just explained, from very much from like a product perspective. Like, how do you think about some of those things, either from a, prevention and control standpoint, but also maybe some novel ways to look through data you have laying around, to find malicious devices or, removable media execution, stuff like that, in like clever ways.
Right. So at this point, I've mentioned response. Defense, as you said, as well. Response was built for visibility first and foremost. Defense is built for blocking stuff, and it gives you the visibility. So we do have the capability in both. And the PSC, as you mentioned, is our predictive security system, where we take all these events from all these boxes across all these industries and use that for our hunting ability. We use that to make good queries. We use that to say, okay, this particular software is happening, across either a large range of things, or it's only happening within a specific vertical. So having data is like core number one to be able to actually write good queries. But also coming into organizations where you don't have that data, you don't have that context. So going with what Tony said earlier about having threat intel, using people, and then maybe it's not coming through your data, maybe you don't have access to other people's data, but you have some sort of indicator out there somewhere. And I've literally been on an IR where the actual IP address that we saw the beaconing going out to was given to the SOC 3 months prior from another ISAC. They had the data, they were sitting on it, they just never implemented it, which is really a shot in the foot for everyone. And then we realized this is actually quite common. A lot of organizations do that. Like, they have indicators, they have threat intel, they just don't do anything with it. So that's our big thing, is you have the data, hunt through the data on a continual basis, and do something with it when you get something out of it.
People don't realize that you can create your own intelligence.
Yes.
It's if you find something evil, congratulations, you have your own IOC. You can implement that in your environment.
Yeah, and so Tony, I was actually going to ask you kind of I had a specific question that came to mind when as Brian was talking too, right? Like, we definitely default to thinking of threat intelligence as, and I would say this is less common than it was, but as like static indicators, right? And they are absolutely useful and kind of like a critical fallback where you don't have visibility into behaviors, or you just expect the behavior might not be exhibiting itself that often, right? But the kind of like the program and process that I know that you've had a huge hand in building is, thinking about behaviors as like probably the most useful form of intelligence, right? And to like kind of like steal Brendan's example, like something executes from removable media, right? That is a very, very simple behavior to identify if you have the data. And probably for most people, like a really high fidelity like piece of intel. So I don't know if you have any like thoughts or examples there, but like I know you spend a lot of time with your head buried in this stuff.
So that's actually my case study coming up on the next one.
Perfect. See how I did that?
Yeah, there you go. Perfect segue. So so my case study, we had a customer, like this is like Brendan's, ripped from the headlines, but all the names have been changed to protect the guilty, where they had a Wanamine infection going very widespread in their environment, and there were credential theft utilities being used to migrate laterally in the network, and there was also a mining payload that was being used at the same time. When you think about how you traditionally hunt for credential theft using Mimikatz or mining using an XMRig utility, something like that, you would think, okay, we're looking for utilities that are unsigned. We're looking for binaries that have malicious reputation. We may be looking for specific command line options, things like that. In our case, we didn't see that. We ended up having to hunt for trusted processes that were exhibiting this behavior. What we found was that the adversary that we had encountered in this environment had started injecting XMRig for mining and injecting Mimikatz reflectively into PowerShell, so that we didn't see in telemetry what binaries were actually being used. All we saw was the behavior coming out of PowerShell. So we had to be very careful to allow ourselves to have wiggle room in the middle of creating detection capabilities, in creating hunt searches, things like that, to have, to take non-traditional techniques into account. Traditionally, this would be an unsigned malicious binary. In kind of the new world that we're facing today, these are living off the land techniques. Somebody is going to be using PowerShell instead of using unsigned binaries, because you can find PowerShell on everything. You're not necessarily going to be able to introduce an unsigned binary into Brendan's environment with, a lot of application whitelisting. So we've found that we have to be very flexible with how we approach things. The key for us is not to have a process that is so well defined, have a hunt that is so well defined that we can't modify it. It's okay to take a process that you have and change it if that change serves you.
Yeah, very cool. That's it. And actually, we had kind of thinking through, a lot of this kind of bleeds over into there's a couple of cool themes here that I just wanted to call out. And one has been, this concept of resiliency, right? And it takes a lot of forms, right? In some forms, resiliency means, absolutely going and acquiring, trading, doing whatever you have to do to get hands on static indicators that are relevant to your industry or to your threat model. On the flip side of resiliency is what we focus on a lot. When we kind of tie this into ATT&CK, right? A huge part of the reason for using a framework like that to drive a hunting program is that it kind of forces resiliency in some of those very behaviorally focused ways, right? So it kind of, again, we talked a lot earlier about towing the line, right? And that's absolutely critical, right? You have to go both ways. The other theme that's super interesting, hearing Brendan talk is just, and all of you, is just this concept of, bringing these controls together in an effective way. And it's, use the concept of battlefield shaping in talks before. And it's being able to eliminate, by whatever means you can, eliminate as much of this surface as you possibly can. The goal being that now we can afford to watch really, really closely what's left, right? So you're not having to look closely at 1,000 things. Ideally, you just have to look really closely at 100. And that's Brendan, I know, we've talked about this in the past, right? Just how much more you've been able to achieve since you kind of took this massive cut off the top of things you had to worry about. And now you're just able to drill in, just go deep on the handful of things that are both hard to detect and control, but also potentially high impact, right? It's I don't know if you have any, I don't know what your thoughts are on that, or if you have any other perspectives, but I know, like I said, we've pontificated over this through many burgers.
Yeah, no, it's so worthwhile to invest the time and resources in something like application whitelisting or CB response and some of those tools, so that you just eliminate a whole class of threats, right? And so then my team is not spending time responding to generic ransomware or these other things that can really be a huge resource suck. We have time to go investigate the more interesting things, the things that are more targeted attacks, are more sophisticated. And so to me, it's so worthwhile to make that investment so that you eliminate that whole class of attacks and can really move your threat hunting program to a more sophisticated place where they're spending their time.
That's awesome. And actually, so we'll move, I definitely appreciate all this. And obviously the discussion's kind of leading in an interesting direction here. And I want to kind of capitalize on that because we have a few really neat questions that have come in. And Brendan, I think first one for you, someone just asked for, for an organization of around 250 people who doesn't have, dedicated resources to do this, right? How do you go about, finding time to wedge hunting into your program, and to the extent that you have partners for that, how do you, or have you gone through the process of selecting, how you want to work on that, which partners you select, if any, and so forth?
Yeah, so I think you actually touched on what's important to respond to that answer, which is you need to take a look and prioritize and see what are the wins I can get in my organization where I can eliminate classes of threats or bring in vendors or technologies that really move my team forward without a lot of headcount or potentially expense associated with them, right? And so there's different utilities out there that we can implement. There's but it may be even as simple as looking at just banning common files, right? So maybe there's some files that we can look at that just should never run in our environment, like SCR files, right? Screensaver files. Not a ton of point in running those, but maybe it's a quick win for my organization. And so if you're looking to kind of build that into a smaller organization, I'd say look at the threat intelligence that's out there and see if you can pull together some quick wins that you can apply in your environment easily in lieu of having a full threat hunting program, right? Because you can make a lot of progress on some of those things.
That's awesome. Yeah, appreciate it. And there's actually kind of a very related question here, particularly in terms of how you balance this as part of a larger program, which is just how deep should like the threat hunting team go once they effectively have a lead, right? So now like you've got your hypothesis, and this is if you imagine the life cycle we kind of talked through earlier. You develop your hypothesis, you start to narrow it a little bit, and now you're onto something that you like can't explain and suspect needs to be run to ground. So I don't know, like Brian, I know you've got a lot of experience. I know you all have experienced this in different ways, but start with you, Brian. Just how would you think about that? At what point does your hunting team say, all right, now this is actually like an incident response problem?
Right, and to tie in some of the comments from Brendan's earlier thing is having the right roles in place to say, okay, I need to reach out to a partner or reach out to someone like that, because hiring is a big issue right now. There's not enough talent on the streets for us to hire people, and that especially comes into fact with IR. Having your team in place to at least run down the initial indicators, and having a team in place to put context to it to say, okay, this is either good, bad, or really bad. And a lot of people get wrapped around the spoke on the bad. And this has been a great conversation in other venues of advanced adversaries coming in and doing their major attack and then dropping ransomware on the way out. Enough to just confuse the security team to think, okay, this is just ransomware, for those who don't have the ability to hunt in further. So time is an issue, yes. And that's where hopefully we come into this automation and so forth, that you do have more time then, that you have your context, you say, okay, let's dig a little bit deeper because I have an extra hour to spend on this. As far as, that's kind of our key issues. You need to at least identify that this is badness, and then the severity to that badness. Severity is in how long would it take us to mitigate this risk, and how much data do we think we lost, if any at all. And then at that point is, okay, do we mitigate this in-house? Do we reach out to IR? Do we reach out to a partner? Maybe a partner can do a quick double check and then reach out to an IR. Having that in place beforehand, contract signed, everything, to say, okay, let's get someone on the call and figure this out, I think is key to that.
That's awesome. Actually, so Tony, I'd like to ask you a really specific question, kind of like same question from the audience, but like a specific kind of angle on it. But one thing I would like to call out too, Brian, is when we, when you kind of take, again, kind of returning big to the maturity model here, right? The huge difference between level 1, and I'd even say the difference, like the huge jump between level 3 and level 4, and that jump from 3 to 4 will cost you as much as everything else, right? But the huge gain that you get from that is that and this is the case with almost any discipline that's like this kind of mix of like process and human process and technology driven, is that hopefully, to your point, the thing that you achieve when you kind of really start to build in automation and refine your process is that, yeah, like maybe your hunt team does have time to go run all these things all the way to ground, right? And really come to some solid conclusions, and everything doesn't have to just be handed off. A huge part of like operational maturity of a security program is that like the different components or the processes that you have or the teams that you have like are operating almost all proactively. And obviously there's like a very reactive, like there's some reactive things you have to do as part of a security program. You could argue there's a lot of them, but the process should be proactive, right? And you should buy yourself time to do each of the things that you need to do really well, right? And Tony, I mentioned there's one thing I wanted to ask you about, where you sit inside of the organization, right? We've got our, like the CERT here, the two big moving parts in terms of, like threat investigation are, triage those things, run the investigation. And then when something gets pushed out the door to the customer, like the huge and really difficult decision tree is like, do we publish or do we kick off, an incident response process? And do we need to actually make sure we get someone on the phone and that everyone understands, scope, severity, impact? So how, what's that decision tree look like operationally for you?
So the decision tree, when you start thinking through of all the different context of what you see in a customer's environment, it really makes sense, but it's kind of hard to explain to new analysts, new engineers who aren't necessarily used to an IT environment sometimes. The decision tree ends up falling around what users do we see on a system? You know, is there a context of what programs do we see running on a system? What is the name of the system? Things like that. If we see Emotet running and spreading on one particular system and it's named Accounting 1, that's something that we're going to tell our incident handlers, hey, we need to take a look at this. But if we see that the name is like DC01 or Exchange 01 or something like this, and we have a clue that, hey, there is major infrastructure involved here. There's an all sirens, somebody needs to be dragged out of bed at 1 a.m. and let's figure out how to fix this. The decision tree really comes down to what is all the context that's surrounding the alert. Whether you find something that is truly evil running on a system, sometimes that can wait till morning, sometimes that can wait till 8 a.m. But if you start seeing it on critical infrastructure, on something that really matters to your stakeholders, something that is going to affect email systems, credentials, databases, things that are mission critical for your organization, that needs to be a more immediate response.
Awesome. Yeah, appreciate that. And so kind of in keeping, talking through some specific examples, you mentioned Emotet, and now like that's kind of been this unusual resurgence in the last few months. It's been really interesting to watch, not in a good way. We had some questions come in specific to hunting for a particular type of attack, and the two that were kind of overlapping are approaching web shells and approaching PowerShell, right? So, and in both cases, like those are not the same thing, although both of them have subtleties in the sense that web shells can very much be like a needle in a stack of needles type of problem, particularly if you're dealing in like a big web infrastructure environment. PowerShell is the same, very similar. Used to be used very sparingly, is now part of a lot of software deployment systems, right? So like Brian, I don't know, like your experience at scale, we only have a few minutes left, but would love to get a quick take on, how you go through just, not even necessarily with those two really specific examples, but something like that you can expect to be highly prevalent. A really small percentage are damaging, but the ones that are damaging are really high impact, right? Like how do you go through like sorting that stuff out and prioritizing?
Right. So web shells is actually something I've done a lot with, and that is based off data, and even just taking Apache logs going back, a year, and literally doing prevalence on URIs and file names, and saying, okay, 99% of the time it's always hitting these same file names. Suddenly I have a 200 come in for this weird one as of this date. So just doing basic prevalence checks of typical activity in your environment on, from this date to this date, we've seen activity, suddenly it's shifted, or suddenly we have a new player on the field who we never saw before. So having that, not just data, but and prevalence checking, but daily prevalence checking to have that come in. You can see the same thing with, types of PowerShell attacks. Turn the logging on and look for those things. Look for connections. PowerShell should not be going out to the internet very often. So if you see it, things like that, hunting for it and looking for prevalence really comes in.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's good advice. And I think, so yeah, last softball for you, Brian. For some reason, a whole bunch of people want to know why all those things are hanging on the wall behind you and what they are. So as the only person here with an interesting backdrop, you get to close us out.
Absolutely. So this is actually a set of badges, of badge life, for conferences where I've spoken at, attended, or staffed. And really they're memories for me, they're experiences. For each one of these, I've learned something. I went to a great training class, I went to a session, or met someone who really taught me something unique. So if I get really confused or wrapped around a stone, I can go to a badge and say, okay, I remember this. I remember going to this class. I really had something to take away from this. And that's kind of like my daily, okay, let's refresh the memory a little bit and think about what I've learned in the past. So that's just a whole assortment of 100 or so of those.
Awesome, appreciate it. Well, so finally, I want to thank all three of you for participating, and everyone who's participated so far, either as a panelist, a presenter, or an attendee for this whole series. We did have a couple of questions come in about whether the previous the previous episodes, if you will, are available, and yeah, that'll all be sent along in follow up. Also wanted to mention, like a lot of this, we've kind of gone through a lot of framing with respect to MITRE ATT&CK. The first ever ATT&CK is coming up soon. We'll be doing 2 talks coming out of Red Canary from Brian and Kyle, focusing on different ways to implement or think about MITRE ATT&CK in the context of a hunting and security programs. And I know we've got Scott, esteemed chief architect over there at CB, who will be doing a talk on ATT&CK and OS query and just kind of using some open source tools to think through how to acquire this data and look through it. So definitely keep an eye out for those. Look it up. It'll be live streamed, so even if you can't make it to Virginia, that'll all be available for everyone. Again, thank you all so much. It's really been a pleasure, on behalf of everyone here at Red Canary, Carbon Black, all of our partners, customers, and the community. It's been an outstanding series. Looking forward to everyone's feedback and questions. And for the questions we weren't able to get to, we'll make sure to follow them in the blog post. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.